We do have ISA and SAF credits for everybody that needs them today. When we get to the end of the webinar and ready to sign off, I'll post that link in the chat box so that you can access it, fill out the info, and then we'll submit those credits to both national offices. Realize that this will be recorded and gets posted at the Woodland Stewards website under resources and should be there in a relatively short amount of time. Look for it here in the next day or two, I'll say, unless Marnie wants to be more precise in when she'll get it posted.
No, I think that's probably good. I'm teaching all afternoon, so it's probably not going to happen today, early next week. Kathy, Danny said that she had some issues signing in, so take your time on the intro because we might need a few other, a few more minutes for people to sign in case other folks had trouble. But it looks like we're doing pretty good with people coming in this morning.
We'll give them, I'll tell you what, we'll start at 5 after.
Okay.
Since folks are having a little bit of an issue.
Yeah.
And you guys are rolling in. See, bad weather kept them at home, so they've got an opportunity to watch it live. One thing I guess I can add to fill a little bit of time is that Todd sits at our Delaware location for the U.S. Forest Service, which is known as the Northern Research Station. I don't know how many of you realize that we actually do have a research station, not associated with a national forest or anything like that. That is part of the Forest Service doing research here in Ohio, just north of Delaware. And the great thing is we work very well together, and we have put out some of their, hopefully, emerald ash borer resistant ashes in a planting at the OSU Mansfield campus. So I think there's about 200 trees. That's the first part of a planting. So hopefully we can do a webinar and give some updates on that research planting. And I think that we probably will also do, some kind of outreach programming around the planting now that it's been installed. It was put in this past fall. So keep your eye out, and we're all crossed fingers that we end up with EAB resistant ash trees, because man, that's a huge loss for us in many, many respects. So, all right, I think we're probably pretty good. So this morning we are going to talk about the ecology of the herbaceous layer in Ohio forests. Dr. Todd Hutchinson, research ecologist from the Forest Service. Todd did a similar presentation for us. What we realized when Todd and I talked was a decade ago at our Woodland Water and Wildlife Conference. So it was time to revisit this one. And I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. So with that, let me stop sharing. I should remind you that questions go in the Q&A, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. Other things can go in the chat, but when we want to deal with the questions at the end of the presentation, please put them in the Q&A. And with that, Todd, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. If you guys could confirm that you're seeing that okay? All right, great. Well, yeah, I want to thank Kathy and Marty for inviting me to give this talk, and I can't believe it was back in 2011 that the similar talk that I gave, and I think it was seemed like it was 5 or 6 years ago. So it's nice to be able to do this again, and I'm really impressed with the number of participants. This is by far the largest group I've talked to in a webinar or online talk. So that's great. Just a little bit more about how I'm coming to this. I just had a general biology degree from University of Louisville in the past, and didn't really do a whole lot with forest ecology during that time. But in between, after I finished my degree, I went to the University of Michigan biological station up in northern Michigan, and I took a couple classes, during the summer. And the best class was Dr. Ed Voss, who a lot of you probably know wrote The Flora of Michigan. He taught a class called Boreal Flora, where we traveled all over that landscape and learned about 400 plants. And so that was really my introduction to botany and identifying plants and where they grow in the field. And since then, in the Forest Service, in my research career, do a lot of work on forest management and how trees regenerate, especially oak forests down in southern Ohio. But part of the research, when we've done management practices like prescribed fire and thinning, I've also looked at the herbaceous plants and how they respond to those treatments. So I've done a lot of community ecology work, looking at counting and estimating cover of the forest floor plants, everything from the herbaceous plants to the tree regeneration. So that's sort of my background. But I'm going to try to, in this talk, it's going to be more general. I'm going to cover some of that, but I would like to also do some sort of general components in the ecology of the forest floor, which is such an interesting part and a diverse part of the forest. Okay, so with that, I'll go ahead and get started here. And really, the great thing about the herbaceous layer in many forests is its diversity. This first image here is from Bohannon Woods in Delaware County, which is a nice mature forest. And we did some sampling there with Kathleen Knight, who we were looking at emerald ash borer effects on the forest when the ash trees died. So this is a really nice woods. It's sugar maple beech and white ash where we did this sampling. So we just had 3 8-meter radius plots where we looked at small quadrats, and then we did a walkthrough. And just in that about 200 meters squared, each of those plots had about 50 species. So that's really nice. And you can see here the Trilliums, really nice spring flora in that Music Woods. And then moving down to southern Ohio, where I've worked a lot, this was a plot where we put in some deer exclosures to look at response to deer browsing with Dave Apsley from Ohio State University Extension. And so this is at Vinton Furnace State Forest. There was a 20 by 20 meter research plot. It was a north-facing site. This is a mature forest that had been clear cut 120, 140 years ago, but had regrown. So it had red oak and yellow poplar in the overstory. When we sampled that plot, there was an average of 19 species just in a 1 meter squared quadrat that ranged from 13 to 26. And then when we walked through the entire 20 by 20 meter research plot, there was exactly 100 species in that plot. So very rich flora down there in southern Ohio. And a drier site. This is at Zaleski State Forest. This is a dry mesic plot. It was primarily white oak and chestnut oak in the overstory. There was a lot of red maple in the midstory. And so this was a drier site upland, and this was part of a prescribed fire experiment. So we had 4 prescribed fires here, and after the 4th fire in that site, we had 16 species per meter squared, which is quite a bit for a drier site down there that's not as nutrient rich. And then when we walked through the entire plot, which was 1/10 of a hectare or 50 by 20 meters, there were 83 species that we identified. And I'll talk more about the fire effects later in the talk. And so that's really kind of the unique thing when everybody thinks, well, tropical forests are much more diverse than temperate forests, and that's generally true. But as far as where that diversity lies, there's a really nice study that compared floras from research plots in the tropics and in Eastern North America. And while the tropical forests are more diverse, you can see that the diversity in temperate forests is really concentrated on the forest floor, where you get 83% of the species that are in that of the plant species, the vascular plant species, reproduce and grow on the forest floor, which is up to 2 meters in height. And you can see it's much more evenly distributed in the tropical forest where you get more lianas and epiphytes and things like that. And it's just so shady at the forest floor. So really the forest floor is really where the diversity is at. And 80% of the species there are herbaceous as well in our forests. And that matches up well with what we find. This was a study that we did on the Wayne National Forest down in Lawrence County, and also at Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, where we had a lot of vegetation plots that we sampled. And you can see that 80% herbaceous shows up here in our 452 species that we found. 66% of those were forbs, the broad-leaved typical wildflowers and ferns that we think of, and 14% were graminoids. So that's that 80%. And while the woody plants can sometimes dominate the understory as far as cover, it's really that the number of species and the diversity is really concentrated in the herbaceous layer, in the herbs. Okay, and this is just sort of just to get you oriented here, just sort of some nice pictures, photos of the different life forms that we find. So again, the forbs, that's where the diversity really is. You all are probably familiar with most of these: wild geranium and woodland sunflower. I'm including the ferns here as well. Sometimes they're separated out into a different life form. And then things like the violets, these really make up the majority of the diversity. But then there's lots of great graminoids too, sedges and grasses. The sedges in particular can be really diverse in some woodlands. There's a couple examples there. And the shrubs, of course, again, they can provide a lot of cover, and they can be pretty abundant, but the diversity of shrubs is not great compared to the forbs. Here's a blueberry and maple leaf viburnum, just as examples. These are things that reproduce within 2 meters of the forest floor. And then of course tree seedlings. That's what most of us forest research people really think of when we're thinking of the understory is the tree seedlings, and what species are there, how big are they, can this forest regenerate to what's in the overstory. And again, they can really be quite abundant on the forest floor, but again, not making up that much of the species diversity. Okay, and really what drives a lot of the ecology of the forest floor? Well, there's several things, but one, probably the most important is the seasonal cycle of the deciduous trees and when they leaf out. So this is just a series of photos showing how rapidly that changes in the spring. This was on my drive to work up in Delaware a few years ago. I took pictures every few days. So this was looking out at a sort of a farm woodlot there on April 16th, still pretty dormant. You can maybe see a little bit of green up on the forest floor there. By April 22nd, you can see the forest floor is really starting to green up, but still not much going on in the mid-story or the canopy. And then already by May 1st, that the canopy is really starting to leaf out. And by May 5th, it's almost a completely closed canopy. And soon after that, it's going to be very shady in that forest. And so the plants that you find on the forest floor, they have to deal with that. They have to deal with the shade. Some of them try to avoid that by coming out really early in the spring. And of course, the same thing happens, maybe not as dramatically in the fall, but as the leaves start to fall, you get the same process in reverse. So that's really an important part of what drives the ecology of the forest floor. And so that's generally how we think of species. You can kind of classify them in different guilds based on their environmental conditions or even their phylogeny. But really the seasonal aspect of it is an important way to look at the forest floor plants. So spring ephemerals is probably what most people think of when they think of wildflowers in the woods, because that's, when you get that they can really cover a lot of the forest floor. And after being through a winter in Ohio, it's great to get out in the woods and see these spring ephemerals, the first ones to come up. But they really don't make up a whole lot of the diversity. That study that looked at the tropical versus temperate forests found that in a variety of forests in the eastern US, that as far as the number of species, those spring ephemerals only tend to make up about 4% of the species. Those are the species that really come up early. They flower early before the canopy closes, and then they die back pretty early too, either before or soon after the canopy closes. A much bigger group of species is the early summer species. So things like Trillium and Geranium and Jack in the Pulpit that do emerge early, and they do a lot of photosynthesis before the canopy closes, but then they also, a lot of times they'll flower it's somewhere right around when the canopy is closing or later, and then they'll retain leaves throughout part of the summer, sometimes deep into the summer. And then there's the later summer species that that flower later in the summer. I think of asters and goldenrods and desmodiums or tick trefoils, things that they tend to have the broadest, thinnest leaves. So they're really dealing with shade. They do come up in the spring, but they live, most of that growing season in shade. And so they tend to flower, anywhere from July through August, September, October, depending on the species. So those are sort of the primary guilds of species. And just to run through those, some more pictures here. Hopefully we'll be seeing these sooner than later. That cutleaf toothwort in the woods is a spring ephemeral. Trout lily, there's yellow and white trout lilies they're great to see in flower. Bloodroot is one of the earliest in the poppy family that comes up, and again dies back and is done flowering pretty early. So again, those are really beautiful parts of the forest floor, but they don't make up, in a lot of forests, they don't make up the tremendous amount of the diversity that's there. But moving into the early summer species, you can also think of these as sort of spring summer species like wild ginger. These really do make up a bigger portion of the diversity. Wild ginger, bellwort, very common down in southern Ohio, is in the lily family. Again, the violets, sort of this late spring, early summer species. Yellow lady slippers. So some of our, really most showy plants also are these early summer species. Then moving into the late summer, I think these a lot of these species maybe don't get as much attention. The things that flower later in the summer. And a lot of times, if it's a really shady forest where there's just no canopy gaps and a completely closed canopy, these types of species are not going to do very well. They're just not going to be able to do enough photosynthesis to flower later in the summer. At least some of them are not super shade tolerant. So we've got small-headed sunflower and the upland boneset here down in southern Ohio. Solidago bicolor or silverrod, and then erect goldenrod. So these are those late summer species. And then there's a smaller group of evergreen or wintergreen species that are really cool, but they don't make up. There's just a handful of species. One that probably most of you are familiar with is Goodyear pubescens or rattlesnake plantain. It's green all winter, but then it flowers sort of unusually. It flowers in midsummer. June and July, which we don't see a lot of plants that flower that late. So it's in the orchid family. And there's a study that's a little bit alarming, very interesting, but kind of alarming, that's been done recently by Heberling and others. They were looking at, they took some data that was originally collected by Thoreau in Massachusetts near Concord back in the 1850s, and then was continued to be collected up until the early 1900s on when plants first emerged and leafed out and flowered in woodlands up there, and then also the canopy, when the canopy trees were leafing out and when the canopy was closing. And so some researchers have been revisiting those woods in the last 20 years or so. And what they've noticed is that due to the warming weather, climate change, that the trees are actually responding more to that weather by leafing out earlier. The wildflowers on the forest floor are leafing out a bit earlier, but there's a mismatch there. So there's a good chance that a lot of those plants that have historically relied on that sunlight before the canopy closes, they're going to be getting less of it. So they won't be able to gain as much carbon and to be as fit as they were in the past. So it's some sobering effects. And I think, one of those things about climate change we may not think about. Okay, another thing that really influences it as we get down into unglaciated southern Ohio, especially where we have a lot of topography, is the influence of slope and aspect on the herbaceous community. Any of you who've been down to southern Ohio, that north-facing slopes can feel and look a lot different than upper south-facing slopes, and that's really based on the amount of sunlight that's hitting those sites and the temperatures, and that's something that's been going on for thousands of years. That even eventually influences the type of soils that are on the north and south-facing slopes. So that's really an important aspect of how the herbaceous community varies across the landscape. So this is an integrated moisture index that we use that uses GIS to predict moisture across the landscape. It was done by Lewis Iverson. And so this was a study where we did a lot of herbaceous sampling, and we had plots that based on that integrated moisture index, we classified those as xeric, intermediate, and mesic. So the xeric plots would typically be the ridge tops and upper south-facing slopes. The mesic plots would be the lower north-facing and east-facing slopes, and the intermediate was those sites that were sort of in between. And so you can see that the species really sort themselves out by this moisture index. It's a sort of moisture and fertility gradient. Things like blueberry and chestnut oak and carex, the sedge, Carex wildenowii, and greenbrier tend to be, they can really tolerate those drier, less nutrient-rich conditions on the south-facing slopes, more acidic soils. That's where they thrive. And then mesic species, this is where we get the trilliums and black snakeroot, wild geranium, and rue anemone. They tend to be pretty sparse on those drier plots, but as you get down to the north-facing slopes where it's more fertile and more moist, they tend to do really well there. And then there are a lot, there's also a fair number of species that are generalists that you can find across the landscape, both woody and herbaceous species like red maple, white ash. This was before EAB, and desmodium and the false Solomon seal. So really do have these different, not all species are, favor one or the other as far as the moisture classes. Okay, and then looking at species diversity, there's a lot of graphs here, but just the take-home point pretty much is that on the x-axis, those are the variables generally that are moisture and fertility. So as you go to the right, the plots, each dot is a plot. They're getting more moist and more fertile, and the number of forbs or richness per quadrat is on the y-axis. And you can see that for the moisture, for nitrogen, also for pH, as all of those moisture and fertility factors increase on a plot, you tend to get more of those forbs in a typical forest in southern Ohio that's not mature forest that's not disturbed. So that the species composition, then also the diversity, can vary across the landscape. And then one of the things that's pretty interesting about a lot of these forest herbs is that they're clonal. Not all of them are, but more than 50% are clonal. So they have rhizomes that go through the soil and even up into the leaf litter layer, and so they sort of move around on the forest floor over time. A lot of times those rhizomes will then die back as they get older. But it's an interesting aspect of the way these plants deal with the forest floor environment. This is an example from mayapple. also talk, a little bit about geranium. There's many species that are clonal. Wild ginger is another one. Okay, another sticking with the roots. Then, all the plants that you'll find in the forest floor have mycorrhizal associations. This is an example here in Trillium grandiflorum of VAM mycorrhizae that are in the roots. And so it's an association of the plant root and the fungus, and the fungus enhances the plant uptake of nutrients. It can also protect the roots from pathogens. And so again, all plants are colonized by mycorrhizal fungi, and it tends to, those associations tend to be stronger where the nutrients are more limited. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with wild geranium here in a minute. And then once those plants, even though they're clonal, sexual reproduction, flowering, and seed dispersal is an important part of the ecology of the forest floor herbs. And there's a variety of ways that the seeds get around. Really, two of the most common are wind dispersed seeds that can travel farther, even though the plants are not tall. And then just gravity and or ballistic, where the seeds are expelled but not very far. There's animal dispersal that can be further in distance. And one of the most interesting, that's just sort of unique to forest understories, is dispersal by ants. And there's a lot of species that we're familiar with that do have ant dispersal, like trilliums and ginger, bloodroot, spring beauties. So this is also a pretty common type of seed dispersal. And of course, it's not very far dispersal, but it can be very good for getting a new plant established. The seeds of these plants have elaiosomes, which is a fatty structure on the seed that the ants will gather the seeds and take them back to their nest. They will eat the elaisome, but not the harder seed coat. And so they deposit that in their nest, which is a really good environment for seedling establishment. It's buried, it's underground, it's nutrient rich from the ants' waste, and it's protected from other things that might eat the seeds. So it's really a neat mutualism, this ant and plant dispersed seeds. Now back when this was first really being looked at was back in the late 70s and early 1980s. There were a couple studies that in New York and West Virginia that looked at really mesic forests, rich forests, and they estimated that about 30% of the species, the herbaceous species on those forest floors were ant dispersed. And a couple different studies found that. Recently, within the last year, there was a study that looked at vegetation plots that had been sampled in 44 national parks in the eastern US, so a much wider variety of forest types. And they looked at the flora and how many species were ant dispersed, and they actually found quite a bit, still a lot, 9% of the herbaceous flora was ant dispersed, but it's probably a case of when you do have the real mesic forest that has a lot of things like trillium and things like that, it is a higher proportion of those species that are ant dispersed, but maybe in drier forests that don't have as many of those spring ephemerals and spring species, it's not as high. So that's more of a wide survey that found about 9% were ant dispersed. Still, that's a lot. Okay, and I'd like to just focus on a couple species that are very common, but I would say still in general there's not that much known about the ecology of most of the species that occur. Of course, we know how to identify them. We know some things, when they flower, how they set seed and all, but a lot of the interactions they have really, a lot of the species, especially the less common ones, have not been studied very much. But there are some species where a lot of work has been done to learn more about their ecology, and geranium is one. Way back in 1965, there was a really nice life history study of geranium that was done in Indiana by a nun, actually by Sister Martin, and so she did a lot of studies, a lot of neat stuff to look at geranium, and that was at a time when not much at all was known about some of these herbaceous plants. But she found that it is a clonal species. There's a rhizome that's branched pretty near the surface, and it can spread quite a bit. A single plant then can make a colony of stems that come up from that rhizome of a meter to by a half meter. And it really does, even though we think of a lot of these plants as being shade tolerant because they're on the forest floor, they do really need, for sexual reproduction, they really need to have full sunlight or at least partial sunlight to flower and produce seeds. So she found that a plant that was a geranium plant that was growing in full sun actually had 638 flowers and produced up to 2,000 seeds. She found that it was cross-pollinated, but it could also self-pollinate. Lots of different insects visited to pollinate, and also it had this ballistic seed dispersal where the seeds dry, and as they dry out, they dehish and they expel the seeds up to a meter away. So an interesting seed dispersal, and just like almost all of the herbaceous plants, it requires cold stratification after the seeds are dispersed in order for them to, they're dormant when they're dispersed and have to go through a cold stratification to germinate. And they're also it's very, very uncommon to have seeds that are long-lived in a seed soil bank, at least amongst what we think of as the typical spring flora. There are certainly some weedy species that are found in the forest floor, things like rubus that can have seeds that can live a really long time in the soil. But for the most part, the seeds just have a 1 or 2 year lifespan in the soil. And if they don't germinate and start a new plant, then those seeds are lost. Okay, also a nice study done by Ralph Borner, who's a professor at Ohio State and a student back in the late 1980s on geranium. They found that when gaps were created in a forest above patches of geranium, that the first year that the gaps were created, that there wasn't a whole lot of increase in growth, but by the second year that those plants had more sunlight, the plants were larger, they flowered more. So in that first year, it was just 5% flowering in the gap and 2% in the closed canopy. But then by that second year, 20% of those plants were flowering in the gap. So a lot of these species, except for the early spring ephemerals, they really do need gaps in the forest to eventually to sexually reproduce. And another very interesting study by Ralph Borner was looking at the mycorrhizal infection of geranium. So he excavated plants from Bohannon Woods, which I showed you before up in Delaware County, which is a rich woods, and then Neotoma Valley, where a lot of research was done down in Hocking County. It's now in Clear Creek Metro Park. So this was more of a oak woods that had some places that were moist and some places that were dry based on slope and aspect. And Ralph found that that at Neotoma, where it's a little bit more nutrient poor, that 58% of the root length was infected with mycorrhizae. But at Bohannon, a richer site, only 21% of the root length was infected. So it really, but the plants were similar in size and fitness. So it really showed that the mycorrhizal infections benefit the plants more when nutrients are limiting in sites that aren't as rich. So it's really a benefit, but all plants do get infected, just more so in those more nutrient poor sites as the mycorrhizae help to uptake nutrients. Okay, and then Trillium, definitely one of the most noticeable and beautiful wildflowers. This is large white Trillium grandiflorum in Ohio. So there's been just a lot of work done on Trillium over the years. And I just want to point out a couple of interesting interesting studies that have been done. When I went, I had mentioned that I went to University of Michigan Biological Station back in that was in the early 90s. One of the classes I took, we did excavate Trillium roots, these corms, because you can age them, kind of like a tree has rings. You can look at these annual growth constrictions on the rhizome, and you can count those to get an age. Sometimes the older part of the root will die back, so you may not be getting the if it's a really old Trillium, you may not be getting the oldest part, but you can get a pretty good idea that it's at least X number of years old. So that's led to some interesting work in a population of Trillium. In this study, you can see that the number of annual constrictions, or the age, roughly the age, is on the x-axis, and the number of plants the number of roots they excavated is on the y-axis. You can see that a lot of those Trilliums were 12, 16, 20 years old. Even one plant was up to at least 32 years old. And you can also see that as those plants got older, that they became more reproductive, a greater proportion became reproductive. So even like trees, where think of an oak tree may not produce acorns until it's 30 or 40 years old. These Trilliums, unless they're just in great conditions, they may live 15 to 20 years before they have enough energy stored to flower and produce fruit. And then the Trilliums, like a lot of those species that I mentioned, are ant dispersed. So this was a nice study that actually followed the fates of seeds that as ants dispersed them, the distance and direction as they took those seeds to the nest. Generally pretty short distance, but not always, up to several meters for some dispersal events. And then deer also, and we'll talk more about deer, but deer like to eat Trillium seeds, and they can disperse them quite a long distance. It's usually less than 1,000 meters, but you can see by this study, it could be up to 4,000 meters, more than a mile. So another interesting dispersal ecology there of Trillium grandiflorum. Another thing that's really, especially in Ohio, that's really noticeable is that you'll see different woods and different woodlots have a much different feel to them and different structure, and a lot of that is based on past land use history. On the left on this shot is this is up near Alum Creek State Park, where this is a mature oak forest surrounding this, but this was on a sort of on a ridge top where it had been pastured, and then the pasture had been let go, and a young sugar maple stand has developed as those seeds blew in, maybe 20 years old now. But you can see that on the forest floor there, because it was pastured, it's very shady now with the sugar maple, and there's not much going on the forest floor at this point in the stand. Another stand, this was actually one of those big wolf oak trees that I showed in that phenology sequence from the woodlot up in Delaware County, where this woodlot had been pastured. You can see by the wolf oak, the open grown branches. And then as that pasture was abandoned, trees have, a lot of sugar maple and other trees have established there, but it's was probably never, there's still a lot of nice herbaceous species in there, so it probably wasn't grazed either for that long a period of time or that intensely. So a lot of what we see in the understory community today relates back to the history of that site and how it was used. And of course, in the whole eastern almost all the eastern United States, and then especially you can see here in southern and eastern Ohio, in the period from the early part of the early to mid 1900s, there was an awful lot of farmland that was this is cultivated land that had been let go and reverted to forest. And there's been and there's also, of course, pasture land, like I mentioned, that has been reverted to forest. So, a lot of the forest landscape in southern and eastern Ohio that we see now was not continually forested. It had some period, or at least parts of it had been pastured or had cultivated crops. There's been some really nice research by Ohio University folks, Jim Dyer in the Department of Geography, and then Glenn Matlack and students at Ohio University have looked at the history of forest sites and whether they were pastured or whether they were continually forested or they had been cultivated, and went out and looked at the current vegetation, after a number of years. And so what they've generally found is that what Jim Dyer found, that at least for the herbaceous community, there is a sense that pastured land can retain some species that they tend to be, after a period of decades, they tend to be more similar to a continuously forested site than a site that had been cultivated, and also found that that land use really, when you look at what is driving the species composition of a forest site, that land use is at least or more important than the environmental factors such as the slope and aspect and the nutrients that are in there. And of course, the land use does contribute to what the soils are like as well. But that land use factor can be really important if there was major activity in the past. And then Glenn Matlack and his student found that they looked at a variety of ages of these old pastures and cultivated sites. Some were 20 to 30 years abandoned, some were up to 60, 70, 80 years abandoned. And they found that sort of optimistically that the pastures and cultivated sites, initially the cultivated sites had less species, but they do tend to converge over time and become more like a site that was continuously forested. But it is a very slow process and can take over 100 years to start getting back to a flora that's more similar to what might have been there originally, or in a site that had not been pastured or cultivated. So it's a slow process. And then of course, something we'll talk a little bit more about is you have things like invasive species and deer factoring into the equation now that are going to affect that, how quickly those converge. But sort of the take-home point of a lot of research is that a lot of the forest herbs, though, they don't have far dispersal distances, so it does take them a long time to recolonize a site that had been pasture or had been cultivated. And of course, it depends on whether there's a forest adjacent to that site or whether it was more open country. So it is a very slow process. It can happen, though. And now looking at a couple sites where some of you are probably familiar with the Floristic Quality Assessment Index, where species, the flora of Ohio is, the species are rated on a scale of 1 to 10 based on kind of as more weedy species and non-native species are down near the 0 end. Species that have pretty high fidelity to a certain type of habitat that's not disturbed would be up at the higher end of that scale. So it's a way that you can sort of assess the quality of the flora at a site. And it was, it's been used a lot in wetlands research, but the terrestrial plants also have scores. And so the study that I mentioned that we've been doing with Kathleen Knight on emerald ash borer plots, just to compare the floristic quality of a couple stands based on land use history. The first plot there, the first plots were there at Bohannon Woods, which was that mature rich forest up in Delaware County. It had 52 species, only one non-native species. And so the average score for those species was a 4.6. So, that the coefficient of conservatism. So the average then for that stand it becomes a 33. That's the index, the Floristic Quality Index. And Seymour Woods, which is a Delaware park, which we had sampled some younger plots in there that had been probably pastured or maybe some of it cultivated in the past. It was younger, it had an agricultural history, but had reverted to forest. There were 39 species in those plots. 6 were non-native. but you can see that average conservative coefficient of conservatism was much lower, just 2.8. So that those woods get a floristic quality of 17.7. So that's a way that, you know, you can look at how land use history has affected the floristic quality of those two different woods. All right, now I would like to, we're gonna shift to deer here and the impacts of deer on understory communities. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleague with the Northern Research Station, Alex Royho, who's a research ecologist, and he's stationed over in Pennsylvania. And he loaned me some slides here to show you all today. And so I'd just like to acknowledge him. This is, he's thought a lot about ecological memory and how deer has affected how we think of the forest, and especially over in Pennsylvania, where the deer management has not been as good as it is over here in Ohio. So the deer herds have historically and even currently been much higher than they are in Ohio. And so the browsing effects are greater. This photo here is of Heart's Content woods in Northwest Pennsylvania. It's an old growth white pine and hemlock mixed forest. This was an old, I believe it was back in the 1910s or 20s. There's ecological studies that were initiated in this old growth forest, including a sampling of the herbaceous layer. And you can see a pretty robust herbaceous layer of that's a viburnum hobblebush down there and a lot of other species. So this was before deer really became a problem in Pennsylvania. And so the materials and information that define our forests and shape the responses are being deteriorated, not just by deer, but by other factors. And it's stealthy. It's something that is, to many people, it's slow change and barely perceptible. And the community itself, there's a lot of times the forest community that we're seeing, especially the understory, has become something else than it was historically. And so there's different forces that degrade our ecological memory of what forest understories could be. Of course, deforestation and land conversion, as we've talked about, is a major one, and invasive pests and pathogens, also changes to natural disturbance regimes like for example, wildfire frequency in some areas. But really the huge one for the eastern deciduous forest is the widespread deer overabundance. Again, especially some of the work I'm going to show you comes from Pennsylvania, where the problem has been really acute, but it's certainly happens in places in Ohio where there's not as much hunting pressure as well. And so Susan Stout, who is a researcher at the lab over there in Pennsylvania, is now retired. She had this quote that I'll just read about the deer impacts over there. "We think we know our forests, but in Pennsylvania and many other parts of the Northeast, deer overabundance has changed our forests so much and for so long that we truly don't know how our forest would look without too many deer." And here's a site in the Allegheny Plateau of Pennsylvania where deer browsing really drives the understory composition. Here, you're seeing hay-scented fern as just really, the only species you really see. There's some other things mixed in there, but that's a plant species that's very unpalatable to deer, and so they don't browse that, and that can just grow like crazy as the deer tend to browse everything else, and there's not much competition. Hay-scented fern. And this long-term graph shows the deer management or mismanagement from 1920 to the present in Pennsylvania. That the green line that you see there is the deer densities of about 4 to 7 or 8 per kilometer squared, which is thought to be the sort of the historic range of deer densities, where above that level, you're starting to get into really lots of deer pressure on the vegetation. But in that level and below that level, deer browsing is maybe not a huge problem. But you can see over time in Pennsylvania that deer browsing has been much greater than that. There was a period there where the hunting laws were changing in Pennsylvania around 2000, and the deer herd was population was reduced back to at least historic range, but that has started to creep up again here in recent years. And so that, those deer are really over a long period of time, they're going to be changing the composition of the forest floor by, browsing those palatable plants and then leaving alone the unpalatable. And so it's just, a fact that deer diminish diversity. This photo here is from a 60-year deer exclosure site where deer were totally kept out for 60 years, which that's, maybe not realistic, but it's one way to study the magnitude of the effects. Behind the fence, you can see that there's a lot of woody regeneration has grown back up, and that just has not happened outside the fence, where tree regeneration is just practically non-existent. And so that study, you can see there, was done by Walt Carson and others. There's a 58% reduction in herb and shrub cover on the control site that had deer versus the exclosure. And the same has been found in long-term deer exclosures with woody regeneration is dramatically decreased when there's overabundant deer compared to when deer are excluded. This is another shot here of Heart's Content. So this is that old growth forest today over in Northwest Pennsylvania. There's a list of common species or list of species there along the x-axis. And so this is the current frequency of occurrence. And this work has been led by Todd Ristaw also with the Forest Service. He's a botanist and research ecologist. So they actually were able to locate old transects and plots that were sampled in this old growth forest back in the 1920s, and they resampled to see how the vegetation had changed over the last 80 years or so as the deer populations had remained high. So you can see there's these species that are fairly frequent today, but when you look back at that original survey, you can see many of those species, even though they maybe weren't super abundant, that are just gone today. And some of the more common ones that are almost gone today or gone were actually very, very common, such as that hobble bush there, which is Viburnum alnifolium, that site. So just, and that's again that memory. We just don't even have a memory of what those sites used to look like before excessive deer browsing. Just a list here of some unpalatable species that tend to, not be browsed and that may do fine if deer populations are high, or like the case with some of the ferns, they may actually thrive the more deer there are. And palatable species, these are things that probably were, especially where deer browsing has been pretty intense. These were probably much more abundant historically, and they're still around, but deer have favored these species and tend to keep their populations smaller and less vigorous in the current landscape. And then there's been a whole lot of work. These are some older papers, but there's been more work recently done on Trillium is one. Grandiflorum is one of those palatable species that the deer really seem to favor. So when there's lots of deer browsing, you can tell by the height and the flowering of Trillium that they can really be an indicator of how many deer how much deer pressure there is. And basically just this list here, deer tend to select larger individuals. So you get plants that they may survive from year to year, but they may shrink over time and reproduce less. You can see that when deer are in that historic range of 4 to 6 per kilometer squared, 20 to 30% of that population will be flowering because they've developed enough reserves below ground from not being browsed over time. But when the deer are 23 to 25 deer per kilometer square, you only have 1% of those that are able to have enough reserves to flower. So it really can have, even though it may not eliminate Trillium, it certainly has a big effect on how abundant and how much it can reproduce. And there's been some really interesting work recently. Some of it done on sort of the interaction of deer and invasive plants and how they affect native understories. Dave Gorchoff at Miami University's did a recent review paper where he and some other authors looked at studies where in the eastern United States where both deer and non-native species abundances had been manipulated together in studies, and what is as bad as non-native species can be, and they can certainly have a big negative effect on understory communities. They found that for the most part, deer tend to have more frequent and negative effects on the understory community than do the non-native invasive species, though they certainly can be a problem. The deer problem is really more widespread, and it has cumulative effect over time. I mean, if there's been deer browsing for over browsing for that 50, 60, 70 years, they're going to continue to select those palatable species over time. And then deer, just by their eating species that are palatable, and also the disturbance of walking through places, they can churn up the soil some and facilitate non-native plant invasion. And so the management implications is for that these authors, Dave Gorchoff and others, suggest that with limited resources, it may actually be better if you've got a forest that has both an invasive plant problem and a deer problem of overbrowsing. If your resources are limited, it may be better to start reducing the deer herd first. That may be a top priority, because the implications of overbrowsing for a number of years may be greater than the invasive plants, depending on the species. And this photo here, you can see this is from a deer exclosure that was erected down at Katie's Cove in Smoky Mountains. You can see basically what you see outside of that, where there's too many deer, is microstegium or Japanese stiltgrass that just carpets the forest floor, nothing else. The deer don't really browse that very much. But inside the deer exclosure, it had been up for about a decade or so, you can see that there's woody regeneration and other things, and much less microstegium as well, where the deer have been excluded. So pretty dramatic photo from the Smoky Mountains there. All right, then I'd like to shift to what some of my research that we've been doing down in Southern Ohio on the effects of fire. So we're going to shift now from forests that are, we think of the more rich forests up here in central Ohio, going down to the oak forest, which tend to be on average, drier, sort of a more open forest. Historically may have been more open because of Native American burning. So one of the threats that more and more people are interested in the eastern United States, at least in oak forests or more xeric forests, is the long-term exclusion of fire, which used to be a process on the landscape. And is that having a negative effect on the forest composition of drier oak woods? And so a couple lines of evidence here long-term. Down at the Vinton Furnace Experimental Forest, where we do a lot of our research, there was a flora done back in the 1950s by Gustav Hall, who is a master's student at Ohio University. And so he did some surveys and documented in the core area of the Vinton Furnace he basically made a flora back in the mid 1950s. And we do know from some fire history research that wildfires had been pretty common in the late 1800s and early up until about the 1930s down in this part of Ohio, and including at Vinton Furnace. But then there really had been no fire since the 1930s. So the forest had tended to close in and become more dense over time. So when we went back and sort of redid the flora. We spent a little bit more time searching and found actually more species than Hall did back in the 50s. But in general, we found as far as the native taxa back in the 1950s, 92% were native. We found that in the early 2000s that about 88% of the flora was native. So we did find some more species, and we were better at identifying things like sedges and grasses that he hadn't necessarily broken down into species, but pretty similar in some ways. And what we found that was he also did a sort of qualitative scale of how common each species was back in the 1950s. And what we found, there were about 55 species that really had, he had described as being common back in the 1950s, and that we just don't see today, or they might be around, but they're pretty uncommon or rare. And you can see that broken down by habitat, most of the species that have really decreased over time are the species of dry woods and edges. So this sort of goes with as the forests have succeeded over time and become more dense, and there's been no fire, that these types of species have become much less abundant over time. And just a couple examples of those would be goat's rue, tephrosia, and butterfly pea. These are plants that we still do find today, but they're pretty uncommon down there after. But apparently they were pretty abundant back in the 1950s. And at least tephrosia is kind of a prairie savanna type species that does, and both of these require a fair bit of sunlight and are more summer species. Okay, in Wisconsin, there was another interesting study that John Curtis had done surveys. Some of you probably know about the classic book, The Vegetation of Wisconsin, that looked at different communities, and there was the ecological sampling of those going back to the 40s and 50s that classified the vegetation of Wisconsin. So recently there was a study where for upland oak stands in southern Ohio, a group of researchers went back and resurveyed those stands. They sampled the same number of quadrats, not necessarily in the exact same spots. So this is about a 54-year period, but they looked at the change in species, and they found that there was over that time period, there had been a 23% decrease in the number of native of species, and that most of those that had decreased were native herbaceous species that declined the most. And these weren't, even by that time, the savanna species were already, because there hadn't been fire for quite a while, the savanna species were uncommon by that first sampling. But so a lot of these species that have continued to decline are just more typical oak forest species, not necessarily open prairie or savanna species. And so while I'm sure deer probably play a role, deer browsing has been bad in Wisconsin, they felt like this lack of fire in these oak woods was perhaps the primary factor that caused this long-term decrease in species. Okay, so we've had a couple prescribed fire studies in southern Ohio, and the one I'm going to touch on today is the fire and fire surrogate study, where we had 4 different treatments, either prescribed fire alone, thinning alone, prescribed fire plus thinning, or also just control plots. And this was conducted down at Vinton Furnace State Forest, and then also at Zaleski State Forest and Tar Hollow State Forest. And so just to show you, this is at Zaleski, a control site that this is maybe sort of more of a mesic site. You can see a northern red oak, and there's a lot of sugar maple that has become abundant in the understory, but the understory there with all that shade in this dry to intermediate site is fairly sparse. And then this is another site at Zaleski here after we've had thinning and prescribed fire. You can see it's a more open understory where there's much more vegetation there in that understory layer. A lot of it's woody, and we'll get to that more, but see pretty big difference there. And so we've actually on these sites we've had 4 prescribed fires over now a 17-year period. The fires have been spaced about every 5 years. There's going to be a couple of graphs like this where years are on the x-axis there, year 0 to year 17, and the number of species. This is herbaceous and woody species in a 1 meter squared quadrat. The average is on the y-axis, and so the warmer colors, the red there is burn, and the orange is thin and burn. Those have had 4 fires now. The green line and years are the thin only treatment, and then the blue is the control. And you can see that really it's the sites, the plots that had been burned had the substantial increase in species richness from about 8 species per meter squared up to about 13 to 14 species per meter squared. The thinning, which did bring more light to the forest floor, generally did not stimulate the herbaceous layer. And when we look at the life forms, the species richness, you can see that most of that gain in species richness over time was herbaceous species. There was an increase in woody species richness as well on those burn and thin and burn plots, but the majority of that, the increase in the number of species, is from the herbaceous species. And when we look at 96 of the common species, these are both woody and herbaceous species. This is on the burn and thin and burn plots. You can see that the greatest majority have increased in frequency over time. There are a few species that have decreased over time, and some species that have sort of had a neutral effect, but for the most part, most of the species have increased in how frequently we sample them over time. And these are just some examples of some of those increasing species. Some of them are, sort of think of as oak woodland type species like the world loosestrife or some of the panic grasses or white wood aster. Some of them are just, common things like yellow poplar increases because fire stimulates germination of yellow poplar over time. But so these are, just a list of some of the top 15 increasers. It's a mixture of woody plants and herbaceous plants over time on those burn sites. And really, the primary mechanism, we think, is that the fire that removes leaf litter creates germination of a lot of plants that are short-term or longer-term in the seed bank. As the leaf litter and duff are burned away, it increases germination of a lot of species. And then, of course, there's more light reaching the forest floor as well on the burn sites, and especially the thin and burn sites. And then just to show you just one quadrat that we sampled, which is a one meter squared. Sometimes the number of species can be a little abstract, but this is at Zaleski State Forest. So there's one quadrat, and back in 2000, when before there was any treatment there, this was a burn only plot. We just had 2 herbaceous species, and the cover of herbaceous species was 1%. Woody species, there were 5 species and made up about 4 or 5% cover. So it was really pretty sparse forest floor. And then after this was after 3 fires by 2014, you can see in this one quadrat, we now had 12 herbaceous species that made up 20% cover of the forest floor. Woody species went from 5 to 8, and there's much greater cover of woody species, up to 70% cover. So really, this isn't really an outlier quadrat. It's maybe a little bit higher than the average, but just to give you an example of that, pretty dramatic change over that 14-year period in that one little spot. But what we did see over time is that even though the herbaceous species were, they sort of contributed mostly to the increase in plant diversity, it was really the cover was still dominated by woody plants. So, everything out there resprouts, saplings and larger seedlings, for the most part, of woody plants after they've been killed. And a lot of shrubs like rubus do quite well in a thin and burn situation. We had sumacs coming in, but so really, even though the herbaceous species increased and we had an increase in herbaceous cover, we didn't really get a really strong herbaceous dominated understory. It became shrubby, but also more diverse at the same time. So this is an example of where, there's a lot of herbaceous plants that are mixed in there. There's a lot of richness, but it's really that the biomass is dominated more by the tree regeneration and some of the shrubs. And just an example of some species that are present in the woods down there in southern Ohio, but it tend to be pretty rare if there's not a disturbance event. Here's a couple woodland solidagos. And so we walked through each plot. These are the 4 treatments here. And basically each bar there is a plot and an abundance. If it's a blue bar, there were none of those species, none of those 3 solidagos were present. If it's a red bar, that means they were present on that plot. This was after a couple fires. And the size of that bar is the relative abundance in a walkthrough. And you can see for these species that really on the control and thin plots, they're present in a couple plots, but just very, not abundant at all. But after we had a couple fires there, or thinning and fire, those species had germinated and established in larger numbers in not all the plots, but most of the plots. And the same went for a couple of plants in the aster family, Helianthus, Helianthus, both Divaricatus and Microcephalus. They show the same pattern of being present on some of the control and thin plots, but really becoming more frequent and abundant after fire. And here you can see a couple, after several fires, those plants had established and flowered, and then they were producing seed that was then germinating. And so we're getting a lot of seedlings of some of these species that, I tend to think of as more like sort of open oak woodland type species. Okay, and there's some really getting back to just sort of the general part of the herbaceous layer. There's a couple really good references out there. There's a paper that Dennis Wiggum did. There's the ecology of woodland herbs in temperate forests. It's kind of a review. And then there's a nice book by Frank Gilliam and Mark Roberts also that focuses on the ecology. There's chapters by different authors that focuses on the ecology of the herbaceous layer. And with that, I'd like to give one more pretty picture here of a spring ephemeral that I hope we can see here in the coming weeks down in Southern Ohio. And if you're happy to answer any questions, and I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen here. And thank you.
Thank you, Todd. That was an awesome presentation.
Yes, I agree. Thanks so much.
And I'm
Todd.
ready for spring. As it's snowing here, I'm ready for spring.
Yeah, it's coming, I hope.
It'll get here eventually. So let's see here. We got quite a few questions. I think both Marty and I answered a few along the way where we could answer. But let's see. So Marcia asks, how is beech leaf disease that's killing our beech trees going to affect the forest floor since they shade the floor of our older forests in Northeast Ohio?
Boy, that's a great question. In some cases, some things like that that we think of as a bad thing for the beech trees may have some benefits for species that are light limited that are growing underneath beech trees. I don't think we want to wish for beech leaf disease, but certainly things that things that open up the canopy where light is really limiting to some species, at least the species that need more light might benefit temporarily from that.
Okay. Yes, we don't want to wish for beech leaf disease.
No. No matter how many herbs come in.
I know. I mean, it is a tough one when you kind of talk about that, but you just can't. I feel like we've lost so many tree species that we just can't keep doing this. So Laura asked, how long after the area was excluded from deer at Vinton Station was the count done? And after the prescribed burns at Zaleski?
Yeah, the deer exposure that I mentioned, that count was done soon after, within maybe 3 or 4 years. So I don't think the deer exposure itself really, for that photo I showed, that spot had a big influence on the number of species there. It was just a kind of a rich site, and really down there where we have public hunting at the Vinton Furnace and Zaleski State Forest and all, the deer browsing is definitely there, but it's not driving the system. So that was just several years. And as far as the maybe the second part was prescribed fire, I didn't get
Zaleski.
Yeah, Zaleski. So that one plot that I showed, that was I believe that was a couple years after the second fire. So it was like we did continue to sample all the plots up to year 17, but that photo I showed that one plot was a couple years after the second fire.
Okay. Jan asks, what is epiphyte?
Epiphytes are, do you think things like bromeliads that actually are not rooted in the soil, but they grow on the trees, and that's something that's very common down in the tropical forest. And it's interesting that I was reviewing that paper before this talk, and they hypothesized, those authors, that one of the reasons there are so many things that grow up in the trees in the tropics is because the soil pathogens are much worse, and so plants have actually evolved to not need soil and to grow up in the trees. That's it's not proven, but that's one of their hypotheses as to why there's so much above in tropical forests.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And then she also asked, graminoid.
Yeah, so graminoids are lumping the sedges and the grasses and the rushes together. So just all those things that are sort of in that grass and sedge family. That's just something we do when we're looking at groups of plants.
Okay. So Kathleen asks, where forest floors are decimated by earthworms, can anything be done to restore?
Oh, boy, that's a great
Todd,
question.
the magic answer.
Yeah, so that I wish I would. That was one of the things I'm not that familiar with the research in that area, and that's something I would have liked to add to this talk and do a little bit more to bring you up to speed. But I'd have to plead ignorance a little bit on that one. I would say that I know they can be very devastating. That just getting rid of the leaf litter and the humus. It's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
I don't know if there has been an answer, really.
Right.
I think it's just trying to slow the spread to new areas. And from the research that I've just a little bit looked into, the impacts are compounded when you have invasive species and when you have deer in the mix, just like you talked about, Todd. When you throw earthworms in, it makes the problem a bit more complex and hard to tease apart.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Darn deer. We always blame it on the deer. Joanne asks, she says she's restoring a dry, high canopy maple oak residential area, sloping. She asked about purchasing native plants, and I think someone gave her an answer in another section, but she removed honeysuckle 5 years ago, and not much seed bed has surfaced. Planted seeds have failed miserably, and she's not getting any younger. So I know there's chemicals that honeysuckle leave in the soil that can impact. In fact, for a lot of folks, when I'm dealing with that question, I say wait a year or wait 2 years before you try to plant something, because it seems like plants struggle right after taking honeysuckle out. But I don't know if you've got anything that.
Yeah, I would just say that's just what you said, Kathy, that they do have those chemicals in the leaves that tend to they're alleliopathic, that tend to get in the soil, and that may be the thing that's going on there. Deer might be involved too. Wouldn't be surprised.
Especially in a residential area.
Well, and Marnie and I had kind of chatted back and forth, and I said, I've got spots like that the groundhogs can mow off. If it's close to a burrow for them, you get this dead area within a matter of days when they start gnawing. And so if there's groundhogs, that's anything that does sprout, they chew. So nothing grows, much to my farmer's dismay, because it's usually his soybeans that are at that end. But I think there's a lot of the chemical issue with the honeysuckle that we don't still have good answers to.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And then sometimes, like I said, that as far as the native seed bank, a lot of those species don't have seeds that are, unless they're weedy, that last a long time in the soil. So once some of those species are gone, they're not coming back unless you can replant.
And for some, not so much for honeysuckle, but for things like buckthorn, it changes the soil pH. So what used to be there is no longer a good plant for that space. So you have to understand all of the, I hate invasive plants.
Yeah, I didn't want to give them a good name compared to deer, but that was sort of their conclusion that on the big picture, deer are probably a worse problem, but certainly, yeah, boy, invasives can be just as bad.
Yeah.
Depending on
So
where you are.
Jan asks, canopy gaps also allow for invasives? How do you control? I answered one who was asking about controlling for poison ivy. It's chemical control. I mean, I hate to say it, but if you want good control, it's a chemical. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, but for me, it's like, I'm not a huge chemical fan, but if you want to gain the upper hand on the invasives, that's what you're going to have to do.
No, I would agree a lot of times. I mean, I think, sometimes when things are just invading a stand, you can mechanically remove them or cut them. But, once things get really established, yeah, I've become more fond of chemicals over just seeing as long as they're used properly. I know some people aren't going to want to use herbicides, but certainly sometimes that's the best way to go if you're willing to do that route.
Well, and the caveat to add to that, and I gave the gentleman with the poison ivy question this. So you can chemically control, and yes, all the chemicals have some kind of residual, with a glyphosate being the shortest. But if you know that the residual is 120 days and you want to go back in and plant, wait a year, let the chemical, break down and then go back in. We need to slow it down. It's not that we can treat, plant, and we're good.
Yep. It's a continual
Yeah.
process. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the thought about the question about the canopy gaps as well, like if, some of what I said, canopy gaps can be really good for herbs. They're getting more light, even if they're shade tolerant, they need those canopy gaps to really reproduce and keep genetic diversity. But depending on where you are, you may do more harm than good by creating canopy gaps if there's invasive species. Like down in Southern Ohio, where we did the fire research and we had the thinning and we had the fire, the invasive species are not that big of a problem. I mean, we have Japanese stilt grass, there's some tree of heaven, but they don't dominate those sites. And so that the native species can benefit from that more light and disturbance without the non-natives. But certainly you want to be very careful if you've got those non-natives present.
So Mark asks, how is a seed's dispersal distance by deer figured out?
That's good. That's a good, I think they put some kind of a marker on the seeds. I didn't review all the details, but they were able to find that, go out with a not necessarily a metal detector, but some sort of a detector and locate those seeds, I believe, but don't.
So, well, I was thinking, Marnie, wasn't there something with the acorns and the blue jays in one of our past webinars that we talked about? They tracked the acorns.
And I think, and that's actually, a study that's going on down at Vinton Furnace, where that's more modern technology where they can put a little GPS sensor in an acorn. But I think that Trillium study was a little bit older, and I'm not exact. They didn't have that technology then, but there's some way that they track those seeds. I'll have to go back and look at that. If anybody has any questions that aren't answered, please email me, and I'd be happy to send you the paper or answer questions after.
So we talked a little bit about how earthworms are affecting the understories. We know they're destroying them, I guess, in some respects for your native plants, especially. Unless you want to add anything to that one. Yeah,
I don't. That's that next time I give this talk, I'm going to beef up on the earthworm research for sure. So I know that's important.
So Tom asked, do Trillium seeds require animals to remove the outer covering?
So as far as germination, no, I think it's pretty. I'm not 100% sure, but I think they can, as long as they get cold stratified.
That's what
over the winter. That once I think they can just germinate without passing through an animal.
Okay, that's kind of where I was thinking. I was going to go look when I saw that earlier and I forgot.
Yeah, there may be different, some Trillium species may be different than others. There's a big group, but I think for the like Trillium grandiflorum, I think, yeah, because those seeds that are deposited in those ant nests are not, eaten by the ants, but they do germinate in those nests.
Mm-hmm. So Pan asks, if a visitor picks a Trillium flower, does that interrupt future years' ability of that plant to flower?
Yeah, probably not. I wouldn't recommend doing that too often, but I think it's basically that, the amount of photosynthesis that plant can do and put into that corm underground. And
right.
as that gets bigger over time, if it's not browsed by deer, then it will have enough energy to flower. So.
And he also asked, did he understand you correctly that Trillium plants will not flower until they're like 15 or 20 years of age?
Well, I think at least in that population, which might have been relatively shady, that was the case. But I think probably if you could have a Trillium where you could give it ideal conditions, just like a tree, it may be able to flower much earlier than that. But at least in that population that was a mature forest, it took that long.
Okay. Yeah, here's another worm question. Sorry, Todd.
So I'm putting a resource in, I just sent it in the chat. It's the University of Minnesota Great Lakes Worm Watch.
Oh,
so
great.
a really nice resource for those of you that want to learn a little bit more about the impacts of worms, and just lots of great info there.
Great. And I will say that just from my experience, the places I've spent a lot of time down in Southern Ohio in the oak woodlands is we don't tend to get those non-native worms at least up in the uplands. So we're not seeing non-native worms that, are in those drier forests. I think that the lands that had been lower and cultivated. So that's at least down in Southern Ohio, that's my experience.
Okay. Well, Christine asks, what about jumping worms? Worms, and worms, Todd.
We need to do a worm webinar,
Marnie,
Kathy.
Help, Marnie, I can't, or Kathy.
So yeah,
I
I can't speak too much on the jumping worms either. They're another one of the non-natives. They're showing up in forests. They're also showing up in urban and residential areas. And I know I think here in Franklin County, there's a monitoring system going on. So I think we need to do a webinar on some worms, some worm issues.
Sounded like it.
We will.
So Linda asks if you could re-show the 2 slides to what deer like and don't like.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, go ahead, and I'm kind of working my way down through some of the other one.
Yeah, thanks for that, Linda, because I missed that slide too, and I made a note. I have to go back and find that video.
Okay.
That was a good.
Okay, here we go. Oh, that was the fire. Yeah, and there's probably a lot. This was kind of I sort of picked out some species that were pretty common.
There you go. Yeah,
in Ohio and Pennsylvania, but there are some really nice lists out there. More that I think Extension has put out about a much larger list of what is palatable and not palatable. I would say that my colleague Alex Royho has done some really interesting work. I'll keep this one up here for a second about the relative impacts of deer browsing, and they found that in the Allegheny National Forest that you can have the same number of deer in an area, but if that area, if they did a lot of timber harvesting that created a lot of browse for those deer, that the deer would have less impact in a landscape where at least 20% was young forest, because there's so much browse, it sort of overwhelms the deer. They can't have that much of a negative impact. But if you take the same amount of deer and put them in a landscape that's like 99% mature forest where there's not much browse, any browse that's there, they'll have a much bigger impact. So not that we, that's just, they can have a different impact based on how much browse there is. And then I'll put up this other, there's some palatable species. Again, there's some really nice lists out there, but these are some ones that are pretty common in Ohio.
Okay. Let's see here. I'm trying to pick out some that aren't repetitive. So Eric asks, is the full list available of the declining dry habitat species at Vinton Furnace?
It's something I could put together. I don't have it right at the tip of my hands. That if you'd like to send me an email,
Okay.
I could send them. Yes.
Okay. We can put your email in the chat. Let's
Okay.
see
Yeah. No,
here.
it was on that first slide too.
If you want to flip back to that, you can
Yeah.
do that too. So there's his email address that you can email him that and he can send it to you. Elaine's asking more info about the interaction of deer and honeysuckle. That's kind of I mean, they browse on it. They certainly don't help control it. There's more of a spread issue, I think, because they're still eating the fruit on it, even though they're browsing and chewing on that part of the plant.
And yeah, I would recommend, Dave Gorchoff at Miami University has really done some nice studies of that fact of honeysuckle and deer, how they interact.
Yeah, we have another earthworm. Let's see, one part of this question from Dan is, how does fire affect earthworms?
That's, again, like at least in my experiences, we haven't had those non-native earthworms where we've been doing our prescribed fires, but there is, I do know there's some research going on down in near the Smoky Mountains where the Gatlinburg, those really bad wildfires in 2016 that burned a lot of places in the Southern Appalachians. There is some research. There's a guy named Matt Callahan that works for the Forest Service. He's a Forest Service scientist, and he's looking into the non-native earthworms and some of those in the wildfires and the effects of the wildfires on those populations. So I think there's some stuff that's coming out, but
okay. Let's see here. Any ideas on how frequent fires need to occur in the future to maintain the diversity gained from your prescribed burns?
Yeah, I think what we saw in those fires. Those fires were conducted about once every 5 years, but that there hadn't been fire for 80 years or 90 years. So I really think some of those species, in order to not get the woody, I think to maximize the diversity, you'd have to not allow those all those resprouts and everything to become dominant in the shrubs in the understory. And what we've seen, at least in these type of stands where they haven't been burned for a long time, and there's a lot of saplings that can resprout, that just by having fire once every 5 years, it allows the woody plants to kind of dominate in that understory to some degree. And I think you could, at least for some of the herbaceous, like those oak woodland species, you would have to have fire more frequent, maybe every 2 to 4 years. A lot of it would depend on how open the canopy is too. The more open the canopy is, the more those woody sprouts can grow. So that kind of factors into it. But much different system. But like in oak savannas and oak woodlands, and then longleaf pine savannas in the south, some of those places, they really, to get that lush herbaceous diversity, they really have to burn every 2 or 3 years, or even annually sometimes in longleaf pine.
Okay.
To sort of maximize the diversity.
Okay, so Petra asks, could you comment on the vernal dam hypothesis?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Petra. Yeah, that's something I do know there's research that was done in the past looking at, so those spring ephemeral plants, may not make up that much biomass in a forest stand, but there's this thought that in the springtime, when conditions are very wet, there's a lot of rain, you can have a lot of nutrients running off, that because those spring ephemerals, which there may not be a lot of species, but they can be pretty abundant, that they can really soak up, they can really take up a lot of those spring nutrients before the other vegetation is. So in some ways, those plants are able to collect those nutrients that would normally run and run off into the streams or into the groundwater. So, and I think there's been, I'm not sure, recently there might have been some more work, but it was I think some studies found that they could really play a significant role in retaining those nutrients, and some other studies found that maybe they weren't as important. So there was a little bit of maybe depending on the site.
Let me see here. So Michael says you often showed images of the species you were discussing. Are those photos stock photos or were they in situ?
Yeah, those were, I think almost all of those that were just stuff I took out in the field, so I didn't have to to go get them. But I'd be happy to share. I'd be happy to if there's any that you'd like. So.
Okay. Laura asks, how can owners of small lots, 1 to 5 acres, improve diversity of understory species when fire is not an option?
That's a great question. I think I would go back to Kathy. It would depend on the site, but Kathy was talking about, herbicide or thinning, maybe to increase, if you don't have an invasive species problem, that it just getting more light, creating some gaps, whether that's with herbicide or with mechanical means, might be a way to do that. There are people that are planting seeds, also seeding areas, but I think that's not done as much in the forest. But that certainly could be an option to try to do some direct seeding as well.
Yeah, I think it's tough because I don't know what you're dealing with, current vegetation wise, and what, an urban lot where the soil was so probably grossly turned over. There's a lot of things that you're dealing with in those urban sites.
The best case scenario is when you do have some good native plants, even if they're not abundant, if they're mixed in, you can try to encourage those through your management, whether that's creating gaps or reducing competition from non-natives.
Okay. So Kurt asked, did the I always screw this one up, Hamelamus show any difference in regeneration with thinning and fire?
Yeah, that's the witch hazel, Hamamelis virginiana.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think basically that, we did see witch hazel was not really common, but it was on some of the moisture sites down there. There was a fair bit of witch hazel, and so the fires tended to to top kill the witch hazel, but it would resprout. And I don't think it was, I think basically it reduced the fire anyway, reduced the size by forcing it to resprout, but it didn't eliminate it. I think it wasn't a species that we noticed either increased a lot or decreased a lot.
Okay. In your opinion, best books for herbaceous layer ID?
Oh, well, if it's my favorite for just without getting a dichotomous key out is Newcomb's Wildflower Guide. I find that for woods that it's pretty comprehensive. There aren't many things that aren't in Newcomb's, even though it covers the whole eastern United States, and it does have a pretty easy to use key where you look at the leaf arrangement and then the flowers as well. But it's a key, but it's not real detailed. So that's a great place to start. And then, if after that, it's if you're really getting into it, the flora that like Gleason and Cronquist that has the dichotomous keys or whatever works well for your area. But I think Newcomb's is a great place to start, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Phil asks, what effect does Rosa multiflora have on overall forest ecology?
Yeah, generally bad. I think the good thing though, in a lot of areas where forests are maturing and becoming more shady. The rose does tend to get shaded out to some degree, but you know, it can certainly, if it's a more open situation where the rose can thrive, it can, you know, I'm not aware of any studies right off the top of my head, but I've seen it, you know, pretty much exclude, like honeysuckle, it excludes things beneath it. It shades the forest floor.
Yeah, you're right. One of the things I always tell landowners is if you can get the canopy to close, the multiflora rose really dies back. It may not completely go away, but it's not going to be the issue as long as you've got canopy closure. If canopy's open. Now at the Mansfield campus, our multiflora rose is very abundant, but also is the rose rosette disease. So I keep cheering on the rose rosette disease.
Yeah.
Like, go baby, go. So Frank asks, what is diversity of Johnson's preserve? It's been forest for about 400 years. I don't remember exactly what the data is on it.
Oh, that's the Johnson Woods.
Yeah, Johnson Woods.
Yeah, and that's a good, I'm not sure. I know there's some studies that have gone on about the tree layer in Johnson Woods, but I'm not aware. There's probably been some herbaceous sampling done there or a flora, but I'm not aware of it right off the top of my head. I don't, if Kathy or Marnie, if you all know, or somebody else out there.
I don't know if you go to like DNR's website at the preserve, whether they reference any of that material or not. I haven't been on their preserve website for quite a while. So that might be, or it might be worth reaching out to the preserve manager. And because a lot of times they have that stuff, you know, stocked away in their computer to address stuff. Yeah,
that's a neat, it's been a number of years since I've been there, but boy, those some of those big oak trees there are white oak trees are pretty impressive.
They are.
Yeah.
So Heidi asks, what about trying to reseed or replant herbaceous plants in a degraded forest?
Yeah, as we've talked about, you know, I think it's possible, but tough to get those plants to establish. Yeah, there is like, and I don't know if you all, I'm not really aware of too many places where that's been done successfully. I do know, like, you know, Prairie Moon Nursery up in Wisconsin that has a lot of prairie plants. They also do sell species that are more woodland type plants. And there's probably some success stories out there of getting things to establish, but I'm on the research side, I'm not sure that it's been done very often. They are doing a lot of that, like, as I mentioned, down in longleaf pine areas where they're trying to reestablish the wiregrass and all those, you know, those really diverse communities in areas that still have longleaf pine, but where there's been, you know, farming, or they've been so degraded that they are doing a lot of seeding to reestablish longleaf pine type vegetation. And of course, in prairies and woodlands, they do that to some degree, but in forests, I'm just not sure how successful that's been.
I mean, I've tried, you know, underplanting bare root seedlings when I knew I was going to lose my ash. It's tough. It's not highly successful, and it takes a lot of extra TLC to get them started. And, you know, it's also like putting a come eat me flag out there for deer, because it's like, oh, that's new. I'm gonna go chew on that for a while. Or even the raccoons. I had raccoons dig trees out of the ground and feast on the roots when they'd been in just a day. And I went back the next day to look, and it was like, seriously?
Yeah, and it's another thing that's kind of, you know, interesting is you don't see, you know, as many hours as I've spent out there counting herbaceous plants, for a lot of those species like trilliums and things, it's not real common to see a true seedling. You know, even in a natural setting, it seems like they establish, some of them are clonal and they move around, but the seedling germination and establishment is not real common to see for some of those species.
So Stephanie asks, could you share your citation for the research on burning versus thinning? It's very fascinating. I'd like to read more about the surveys.
Sure. Yeah, and if you could email me and I'll send you there. We did a final report from that study recently that I could send.
Okay. Has anyone studied the effect of droughts on the persistence of oak woodlands?
Probably. I guess, and yeah, I think historically, I think there's still some controversy out there historically, whether droughts sort of sustained oak more in the past versus fire. And I think a lot of people think, fire was more important. Some people think drought and climate was more important. And I think there's probably both of those probably played into it. But yeah, I think that's more looking historically. I think that could probably say that, yeah, when there were periods of major drought, like these 20-year droughts, that would in our central hardwoods region, that would favor oak for that period, even without fire.
Okay. Jen asks, what are practices that we can do as landowners to encourage a healthy herbaceous forest floor? Are plantings of some of those species worthwhile?
Yeah, I think again, it might be tough to plant, but I think just, if there's any way to reduce the deer pressure, and that's a key. And if there's any way, get in there and remove exotics before invasive plants, those would be the two main things. And probably try to limit the amount of disturbance to the forest floor to some degree, even though I talked about how that can be a good thing in oak woods. If it's a more mesic woods, if you have a lot of like ATV trails or something going through a forest, that's going to probably encourage invasives to establish if the forest floor gets really disturbed.
And it's funny you went there, because the next question says, can you reference any studies or comment on the impact of recreational trails to the herbaceous layer and recommendations for mitigating such impacts?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not really aware of studies that have been done that have really looked at that. So yeah, I can't really comment. I do know that there has been some work done with horse trails, that you find more weeds where there's horse trails, where the horses are bringing in weeds and things are establishing, but I'm not as sure about other recreational trails.
Okay. So Jonathan says, in our more mesic preserve in Southwest Ohio, our tree leaves rot faster than the oak litter. We also have non-native earthworms, and the leaf litter seems to be lessening. One, do we know much about the effect of bare soil on forest herb abundance / diversity in the absence of fire? And he's got a second question. I'll wait.
Yeah, and again, that's sort of getting to that earthworm subject that I'm not really that up on, but I think in general, a lot of the forest floor herbs in those mesic areas rely on that leaf litter to be an insulation to keep the soil moist, and because a lot of their roots are very close to the soil, and they could dry out really easily when that litter is removed. So I think in those more mesic sites, and I'm sure some of the earthworm research is focused on this, that it's a bad thing to have a lot of bare soil, even though in the drier forests I talked about how disturbance in creating bare soil can be a positive for some native species as well.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Let's see. So second one, do we know much about litter changes from non-native earthworms? Todd, I think there's something going on here.
Yeah, I know there's some great research out there that get somebody for a webinar. That'd be great.
Todd, I might, after the fact of today, I might reach out to you for some suggestions on some speakers for that.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Thanks.
So let's see. Sarah says, thank you for this great talk, Todd. For the land use history work, do you know of any studies that have investigated how the seed bank has been impacted by prior agricultural land use?
Yeah, I think, boy, yeah, there is work out there on that. I think for the most part, that big difference between cultivating where you have row crops for a number of years versus pasture is that when you have pasture, if it's not totally grazed and planted in non-native grasses for a long period of time, there is some of that, not necessarily the seed bank all the time, but there's plants that survive. Even the rootstocks can survive that pasturing, but they can't survive that being cultivated every year for a number of years. And then of course you do, most of the native herbs don't have a long-term seed bank, but when there's been a pasture or a cultivating, there's a period of time where there's, that's all weeds in there. When they let it go, it turns to weeds. So you do get, and these weedy plants often have long-lived seeds. So even once the forest is reestablished, you will find plants that were weeds when it was cultivated, that will come up out of the seed bank if there's a disturbance, just because it had been disturbed and weedy for a period in the past. But but more of the native species, there aren't the good quality species. There aren't as many of those that have a long-term seed bank.
Okay. So let's see. Do you know studies that have quantified changes in plant species richness and/or abundance after invasive plants have been treated with herbicide?
Yeah, and I can't cite any right offhand, but there have been studies, and I'd be happy to try to find some if the person wants to email me.
Okay. Let's see. So there's someone's posted a link to research done on how bush honeysuckle chemically changes the soil. So those allelopathic chemicals that we were talking about. So Ann says, I haven't seen anything on brambles. I tend to get them overwhelmingly in gaps. Does this mean anything?
Yeah, certainly. And I probably with speaking of raspberries and blackberries, and yeah, we do see a period of time, especially when the canopy opens up, where we get a lot of brambles and some of that research, but it generally does tend to not last. It kind of like the Rosa multiflora, it can kind of get shaded out as the gap closes after a while. There may be a period of 6 or 8 years where the brambles tend to dominate those gaps, but then as it gets a little more shady, those will start to die back. And I think there are species that can survive underneath the brambles to some degree. It's not like they're excluding everything else.
Okay. Coral, I'm glad you're on. So Coral says, back when it was called Graber Woods instead of Johnson Woods, pictures of the forest were in a forestry textbook. And now you're going to ask me which one, right? Come on, Coral. Your brain's only a little older than mine, so. So they were in a textbook somewhere. That's interesting. Cool. I didn't know that. Any evidence, this is kind of a side, any evidence that blue ash may survive the emerald ash borer? It still dies.
It's definitely more resistant and than the other ashes, but it usually succumbs. It's been my experience.
So Katrina says, is the degree of diversity always considered a measure of a forest's health?
I would say yes.
Yeah, I would.
In a way, yeah. I mean, there are the cases that there's sometimes when there's also been some work done that shows that sometimes more diverse forests can also have more invasive species. So there's, sometimes if conditions are good for a lot of native species, they might also be conducive to non-native species establishing. So, but for the most part, I would say, yeah, that the more diversity you have, the more healthy that site is.
Right.
And stable.
Right.
And stable, yeah. And if you lose some species, there's other species there to.
Right. So Ann Bonner chimes in on the young starts. She tells us generously watering your young starts in the first years when trying to plant among trees / degraded wooded areas is necessary. Water, 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 mulch, and deer exclusion fencing. Also planting en masse. You are right, it is challenging. So just keep at it, folks. Let's see. In your field work, are you seeing box turtles in burn areas versus unburned areas? That's a little off.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's we have seen a few box turtle shells. Usually we burn in the early spring before the box turtles are out and around. There was a really nice research study done down in Tennessee where they tracked a lot of box turtles that were in areas that they were doing prescribed fire. And they generally found that, yes, if you're burning during the growing season, which in Ohio, that would be late April, early May or so, that you're going to be damaging and killing some box turtles. But if you're burning during the late winter or earlier in the spring, there's much less chance they're going to get damaged. So, it's something that it's definitely an issue, and the more you burn into the late spring, you're going to have more impact on not just box turtles, but some other snakes and other things like that.
Right.
Okay. Well, we're right about at the end of our time. So Marnie, go ahead and stop recording. And I will